On December 9, 2024, Donald Trump stood before a crowd of supporters and made a statement that sent shockwaves through European capitals. NATO calls me daddy, he said, grinning. The audience laughed. European defense ministers did not, because behind that crude joke lies a geopolitical strategy that could fundamentally reshape the Western alliance, abandon Ukraine to Russian territorial demands, and leave Europe exposed in ways not seen since 1945. And it's already in motion. The statement wasn't a slip of the tongue, it was a signal, a carefully calculated message to both allies and adversaries that when Trump returns to the White House on January 20th, 2025, the rules of transatlantic security are going to change drastically, irreversibly, and the first casualty might be Ukraine itself. Here's what most people missed. That same day, just hours before Trump made that comment, Volodymyr Zelensky received a phone call, not from President Biden, not from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, from Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, the man who has no official position in government right now, but who has been conducting what intelligence analysts are calling shadow diplomacy across Eastern Europe for the past 3 months. The call lasted 11 minutes. No transcript was released, no official statement was made by either side, but two sources familiar with the conversation told Reuters that Kushner delivered a message that was as blunt as it was devastating. Trump has a peace plan for Ukraine. It will be presented within the first 100 days of his presidency. And Zelensky has a choice to make: accept it or lose American support entirely. This isn't speculation. This is policy in formation. And the architecture of that policy reveals something far more complex than a simple peace deal. It reveals a fundamental realignment of American strategic priorities, a pivot away from European security guarantees that have defined the post-World War II order, and a calculation that Ukraine, for all its symbolic importance, is ultimately expendable in a larger game involving China, Russia, and American economic dominance. Let's go back 3 weeks. November 18th, 2024. A classified document began circulating among Trump's transition team. The document was titled National Security Strategy, First 100 Days. It was leaked to The Atlantic on December 3rd. 17 pages, single-spaced, and buried on page 12 was a section that European intelligence agencies are now calling the Betrayal Clause. The section outlined what Trump's team refers to as realistic peace framework for Ukraine. The framework proposes a permanent ceasefire along current battle lines, no NATO membership for Ukraine, ever. A 20-year moratorium on any military alliance between Ukraine and Western powers. And here's the part that made European leaders go pale. Territorial concessions. The framework explicitly states that Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson regions would remain under Russian control. In exchange, Russia would agree to end active combat operations and participate in what the document vaguely describes as economic normalization protocols. In plain language, Trump is prepared to give Putin exactly what Putin wants and frame it as peace. The document also contained a financial component that reveals the true motivation behind this strategy. It proposed redirecting the billions currently allocated for Ukrainian military aid toward what it calls hemispheric defense priorities. Translation: the US-Mexico border, Caribbean security zones, and Pacific Fleet expansion to counter China. The message is clear: Ukraine is Europe's problem, China is America's priority, and Trump is willing to sacrifice one to focus on the other. But there's a deeper layer here, one that involves money, real estate, and the kind of transactional thinking that has always defined Trump's approach to foreign policy. 3 days after that classified document leaked, investigative journalists at ProPublica published findings that raised serious questions about the financial incentives behind Trump's Ukraine policy. According to their research, several members of Trump's transition team have direct or indirect financial interests in Russian energy companies that have been sanctioned since 2014. Not Trump himself, but close advisors, people who will have significant influence over policy decisions. One name keeps appearing: Dmitry Firtash, a Ukrainian oligarch with deep ties to Russian gas giant Gazprom. Firtash has been fighting extradition to the United States on corruption charges for over a decade. And according to ProPublica, Firtash's legal team has been in contact with members of Trump's inner circle about the possibility of a political resolution to his case. The implication is obvious. If Trump normalizes relations with Russia, if sanctions are lifted, if Ukraine is forced into territorial concessions, people like Firtash benefit enormously. And so do the American lawyers, consultants, and businessmen who have tied their financial futures to Russian economic interests. This isn't about peace, it's about profit, and Ukraine is the bargaining chip. Now let's talk about Zelensky's response, because this is where the story gets truly dangerous. On December 11th, 2 days after Trump's daddy comment, and 2 days after Kushner's phone call, Zelensky gave an interview to the Financial Times. He was asked directly about reports of Trump's peace plan. His answer was defiant. Ukraine will never accept territorial concessions, he said. We will fight until every inch of our land is liberated, with or without American support. That last phrase is critical: with or without American support. It's a statement of independence, but it's also a statement of desperation, because Zelensky knows what European leaders know. Without American weapons, without American intelligence, without American financial backing, Ukraine cannot sustain its defense. The European Union has provided significant aid, but it cannot replace the scale and sophistication of American military assistance. And Trump knows this, which is why Kushner's message wasn't really offering Zelensky a choice. It was delivering an ultimatum: accept the deal or watch your country collapse. European capitals are now engaged in frantic behind-the-scenes negotiations to figure out how to respond. On December 10th, French President Emmanuel Macron held an emergency call with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The call lasted 90 minutes. Afterwards, Macron's office released a terse statement. France and Germany remain committed to Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Standard diplomatic language. But intelligence intercepts suggest the conversation was far more alarming. According to sources, Macron told Scholz that Europe needs to prepare for a scenario where the United States withdraws security guarantees not just from Ukraine, but from NATO itself. This is the nightmare scenario European defense planners have been warning about for years: an America that decides European security is no longer worth the cost. An America that views NATO not as a sacred alliance, but as a protection racket, where Europeans aren't paying enough. Trump has been saying this openly since his first term, but now he's in a position to act on it, and the implications are staggering. Here's what that looks like in practice. Poland has already announced it will increase defense spending to 4% of GDP, the highest in NATO. The Baltic states are requesting permanent American troop deployments, knowing that Trump might withdraw them. And behind closed doors, European defense officials are discussing something that was unthinkable just 5 years ago: European nuclear deterrence independent of the United States. France has nuclear weapons. So does the United Kingdom. But a coordinated European nuclear strategy without American oversight would represent a fundamental break in the transatlantic relationship. And Russia is watching all of this with satisfaction, because this is exactly what Putin has wanted for decades: a divided West, an America retreating into isolationism, a Europe scrambling to defend itself without the resources or unity to do so effectively. Putin doesn't need to invade Poland or the Baltics if NATO collapses from within. And Trump's peace plan for Ukraine is the wedge that could make that collapse possible. But there's another player in this game that most analysts are overlooking: China. Because while everyone is focused on Ukraine and NATO, Beijing is paying very close attention to what Trump's strategy reveals about American credibility. If the United States can abandon a partner like Ukraine after 3 years of promises and military support, what does that say to Taiwan? What does that say to South Korea? What does that say to Japan? Trump's team argues that abandoning Ukraine allows America to focus resources on the Indo Pacific, but Chinese strategists see it differently. They see an America that makes commitments it doesn't keep, an America that treats alliances as transactions, an America that will sacrifice strategic partners when the cost becomes inconvenient. And that perception matters, because the entire architecture of American power in Asia is built on the credibility of U.S. security guarantees. If that credibility collapses in Europe, it collapses everywhere. This is why senior Pentagon officials are deeply alarmed by Trump's approach. Not because they love Ukraine, but because they understand that credibility is a strategic asset. And once you lose it, it's almost impossible to regain. On December 8th, just one day before Trump's controversial statement, General Christopher Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, gave a classified briefing to the Senate Armed Services Committee. The contents of that briefing were leaked to the Washington Post. According to their reporting, Cavoli warned that if the United States pressures Ukraine into territorial concessions, it will send a message to every adversary on the planet that aggression works, that if you can inflict enough pain, if you can sustain a conflict long enough, America will eventually force its partners to surrender. Cavoli specifically mentioned China and Taiwan. He told senators that Chinese military planners are already gaming out scenarios where the United States abandons Taiwan after an initial conflict becomes too costly. And Trump's Ukraine strategy provides the blueprint for exactly how that abandonment would work. First, public fatigue with the cost of supporting a distant ally. Second, political pressure to redirect resources to domestic priorities. Third, a peace plan that sounds reasonable but amounts to capitulation. And finally, the abandonment itself dressed up as pragmatism. The Pentagon understands this. European leaders understand this. Even some Republicans in Congress understand this. But Trump doesn't care, because Trump's worldview is transactional, not strategic. He sees alliances as costs, not investments. He sees NATO as a burden, not a force multiplier. And he sees Ukraine as a money pit, not a partner defending principles that underpin the entire liberal international order. Now let's talk about the timeline, because this isn't some distant hypothetical. This is happening in real time. Trump will be inaugurated on January 20th, 2025. That's 5 weeks away. His transition team has already indicated that Ukraine policy will be addressed in the first 100 days, which means by late April, Trump will likely present his peace plan. And when he does, Zelensky will face an impossible decision: accept a deal that surrenders Ukrainian territory and sovereignty, or reject it and watch American support evaporate. European leaders are already preparing for the second scenario. On December 12th, Just yesterday, the European Union announced a new 50 billion euro aid package for Ukraine over 4 years. It sounds impressive, but analysts point out that this is less than half of what the United States has provided in military aid alone, and it's structured as loans, not grants, which means Ukraine would be taking on massive debt with no guarantee it could ever repay. This isn't solidarity, it's a stopgap, a desperate attempt to signal that Europe won't let Ukraine fall. But the reality is that without American weapons, particularly advanced systems like HIMARS, Patriots, and F 16, Ukraine cannot match Russian firepower, and Russia knows it, which is why Russian forces have intensified attacks in recent weeks. Not because they expect to win the war militarily, but because they want to maximize territorial gains before Trump takes office and forces Ukraine to the negotiating table. Every village Russia captures now is a village they'll keep in Trump's peace deal. And Putin understands this dynamic perfectly. He's not trying to conquer all of Ukraine. He's trying to conquer enough of Ukraine that when Trump freezes the conflict, Russia gets to keep the most valuable pieces. The industrial heartland, the resource rich regions, the land bridge to Crimea. This is where Kushner comes back into the picture. Because Kushner isn't just delivering messages, he's conducting negotiations. And according to sources familiar with these discussions, Kushner has been meeting with Russian intermediaries through back channels in Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. These aren't official diplomatic contacts, they're exploratory conversations, feeling out what Putin would accept, what Putin would reject, what concessions Putin might be willing to make in exchange for getting everything he really wants. And what Putin really wants is simple: formal recognition that Crimea is Russian territory, a guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO, the lifting of sanctions on Russian energy exports, and security guarantees that the West won't arm Ukraine in the future. In exchange, Putin is willing to stop active combat operations, not withdraw from occupied territories, just stop shooting. And in Trump's transactional worldview, that counts as peace. But here's the part that should terrify everyone. If this deal goes through, if Ukraine is forced to accept these terms, it doesn't end the conflict, it freezes it. And frozen conflicts are Moscow's specialty. Look at Georgia. Russia invaded in 2008, carved out South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and then just stopped. Those territories are still occupied today, still in limbo, still preventing Georgia from joining NATO, because NATO won't accept members with active territorial disputes. The same strategy worked in Moldova with Transnistria, and it could work in Ukraine. Trump's peace plan doesn't solve the Ukraine problem, it just makes it someone else's problem, specifically Europe's problem. And that's the point. Trump wants to disentangle America from European security so he can focus on China. But the strategy is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how power works. You can't just abandon one theater and expect to be taken seriously in another. China is watching how America treats Ukraine, and they're taking notes. There's also a domestic political dimension to this that can't be ignored. Trump's base loves the idea of ending the war in Ukraine. They see it as America first in action, bringing troops home, stopping the flow of billions to a foreign country, focusing on problems here at home. And Trump knows this, which is why he's framing the Ukraine issue as a choice between endless war and pragmatic peace. But it's a false choice. Because what Trump is offering isn't peace, it's surrender. And the consequences of that surrender will be felt for decades. Let's game out what happens next. Scenario 1. Zelensky refuses the deal. Trump cuts off aid. Ukraine's defense collapses within 6 months. Russia advances, European countries panic and try to fill the gap but can't. Ukraine is forced to accept an even worse deal with no Western backing. Putin wins. Trump claims he tried to make peace, but Zelensky was unreasonable. Europe is humiliated, NATO is weakened, and every adversary on the planet learns that American security guarantees are worthless. Scenario 2, Zelensky accepts the deal under pressure. Ukraine surrenders territory. Putin declares victory. Russian propaganda celebrates the defeat of NATO. Pro-Russian governments gain ground in elections across Europe. Poland and the Baltic states lose faith in American protection and either dramatically increase their own military spending or seek accommodation with Russia. NATO becomes a hollow shell. And within 5 years, Putin tests the alliance again, this time with a member state, knowing that Trump set the precedent for abandoning partners. Scenario 3, Europe steps up independently. France and Germany lead a coalition that provides Ukraine with enough support to continue fighting even without American aid. This would require a massive increase in European defense production, which takes years to build. It would require unprecedented unity among 27 EU member states, which is almost impossible. And it would require Europeans to accept casualties and costs they've been unwilling to accept so far. This scenario is theoretically possible, but practically unlikely. Every scenario is bad. Every outcome weakens the West. And Trump either doesn't understand this or doesn't care. Because for Trump, foreign policy is about domestic politics. And domestically, abandoning Ukraine plays well with his base. It reinforces his image as the guy who ends forever wars. Never mind that this war isn't forever. Never mind that Ukraine is winning in some areas. Never mind that abandoning Ukraine sets precedents that will come back to haunt American interest around the world. There's one more element to this story that deserves attention: the role of disinformation and narrative control. Russian state media is already celebrating Trump's return as the end of Western support for Ukraine. They're running segments showing how tired Americans are of the war, how expensive it's been, how it's not working anyway, and they're preparing the ground for Trump's peace plan by framing territorial concessions as the only realistic option. This narrative is being amplified by right-wing media in the United States and Europe, and it's working. Polls show declining support for Ukraine aid in key NATO countries. But here's what those polls don't capture. They don't capture the strategic consequences of abandonment. They don't capture what happens when adversaries learn that aggression works. They don't capture the cost of rebuilding American credibility after it's been shattered. Those costs are abstract, hard to measure, easy to ignore, until suddenly they're not. Until suddenly, China is invading Taiwan because they watched America abandon Ukraine and figured they'd get away with it too. Until suddenly, Russia is threatening Poland because NATO proved to be a paper tiger. Until suddenly, American troops are fighting wars that could have been prevented if deterrence had held. This is the world Trump is creating. Not intentionally, not strategically, but through a combination of transactional thinking, domestic political calculation, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how international order is maintained. Trump sees NATO as a cost, but NATO is an investment that has prevented major wars in Europe for 80 years, an investment that has made American power global rather than regional, an investment that has created stability, prosperity, and security for billions of people. And Trump is about to liquidate that investment. For what? To save money, to stick it to Europeans he thinks are freeloading, to make a deal with Putin that will be celebrated for a week and regretted for a generation. The calculus doesn't add up unless you understand that for Trump, the only calculus that matters is his own political survival, his own image, his own legacy as the deal maker who ended the Ukraine war. Never mind the cost, never mind the consequences, never mind the people who will die because of decisions made in the Oval Office for reasons that have nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with ego. Zelensky understands this, which is why his defiance in that Financial Times interview was so significant. He's not just rejecting Trump's plan, he's rejecting the entire framework of transactional foreign policy. He's saying that some things can't be negotiated, that sovereignty isn't for sale, that principles matter more than expedience, and he's betting that history will prove him right. But history is a long game, and Zelensky might not survive long enough to see it play out. Because in the short term, Trump holds all the cards: the weapons, the money, the intelligence, the diplomatic leverage, and he's willing to use all of it to force Ukraine into a deal that serves American political interest at the expense of Ukrainian survival. The next 100 days will determine whether the post-World War II order survives or collapses, whether American credibility can be salvaged or is permanently damaged, whether Europe can defend itself or remains dependent on an unreliable partner, whether Ukraine continues to exist as a sovereign nation or becomes a Russian satellite state, whether NATO endures or disintegrates, whether democracy and sovereignty still mean something or are just nice words that vanish when they become inconvenient. And all of it hinges on a phone call, a classified document, a crude joke about being called daddy, and a peace plan that isn't about peace at all. It's about power. It's about abandonment. It's about the end of an era and the beginning of something much darker. Trump returns to office on January 20th. The clock is ticking, and Zelensky is running out of time.